muting yourself unless you raise your hand and would like to speak. We do encourage us to be very much a conversation, so feel free to interject throughout the presentation. We will have a Q&A section at the end if you feel it's more appropriate to wait. But welcome. I'm Nate Pelzer from the California Product Stewardship Council. I'm also the chair of the California CRRA HHW TC. That's the Household Hazardous Waste Technical Council. And one of our goals for this year is to host one or more webinars on trending topics related to the focus of the TC, which is, again, HHW. Many of you are members of CRRA and or the HHW TC, so thank you for joining us. We've got a really special guest. His name is Larry Sweetser. Wanted to give you just a brief introduction for Larry. A graduate of UC Berkeley. Larry is California's resident HHW expert. For a number of years, over 14 years, nearly 15, he was the director of regulatory affairs with NorCal Waste Systems. Since just before the turn of the millennium, he has been the owner-operator of Sweetser Associates, traveling the state far and wide, answering questions, helping advise folks in regards to HHW and other topics. He is also, Larry, I believe you're the chair or co-chair of the statewide anti-dumping committee, and he's one of our state's resident policy gurus. We oftentimes find ourselves going to Larry with very technical questions about HHW issues as we at CPSC try to formulate and help implement statewide a number of policy solutions to HHW issues. So I'll hand it over to Larry and ask if you could give us a little bit more of an introduction, and then we can dive right in.
Well, that's a pretty good introduction, and overall, I don't know if there's anything really to add to it other than I recognize many of you and glad to help out. And as many people know, I like questions, especially about weird waste. You see the slides up?
Yes.
Okay. So just get started. So thanks for having me here today. We'll just get to talk about some fun things with HHW, some of the newest things that have happened, and also some of the ongoing struggles that many of you have in weird waste. So as far as trends, as many of you know, household hazardous waste is a public service, so it's unlike many other programs that handle hazardous waste, and that people are trying to do this for the right reasons. And I really like this group because of that reason, always willing to help. So we'll continue on that tradition. But you're seeing a lot of changes going on right now, more emerging problem waste. We'll talk about a few of them today. Also, costs are going up. Many of you probably experienced significant cost increases. I know many of them for certain waste streams have gone up 50 to 100% and having to deal with that. And then also your budgets are also getting impacted by that as well as always. And we continue to find that HHW programs tend to be the dumping grounds for a lot of things that people don't want. And I also deal on the solid waste side where I get a lot of stuff in the solid waste landfills, transfer stations that there are also problems. So we're also getting a lot more regulatory scrutiny. There's always attempts to try to put household hazardous waste programs in the same boxes as business waste and large quantity generators, and that's an issue that we continue to deal with. And so that's where the joke is, little note here, actually don't try it. The 1-800-ASK-LARRY is typically the way it feels. Many of you get the chance to ask questions. So thought I'd start out with some of the legislation that was approved. It was actually a pretty good year for legislation affecting HHW programs. And these all are effective in place. So AB 2481, I'll spend a good amount of time on that because that's a new one. It's the first major change in HHW regulations since the 90s. And then also AB 2208, fluorescent lights, prohibiting the sale of compact fluorescents and linear tubes coming here in the near future, which means we'll take a poll on how long it'll take before the lamps get out of the system. But we'll still be dealing with lamps for a few years. But also what it also means we'll be dealing with less fluorescent light ballasts, hopefully, which are a pretty very expensive item to get rid of. Then the two battery bills, the both 2440 on battery embedded product and the 1215, SB 1215 on covered battery embedded products. So that's stewardship programs are going to be out there. One is 2440 is pretty much dealing with covered batteries. And I'm sure many of you have heard information on what's involved in each one of those, but pretty much it's going to include most loose batteries or ones that are removable with common household tools, which is an item we'll talk about in a second. And then there are some exemptions to that, particularly the larger batteries, including some of the rechargeables over 300 watt hours, which are a problem, but also lead acid batteries, motor vehicle batteries are also excluded, as well as healthcare. And then on the 1215 is expanding the e-waste program, the covered electronic waste program, to include battery embedded products. And battery embedded means not easily removed with common household tools. And the running joke that many of us have had is that we need to make sure when they go through the regulations on this that a hammer is not a common household tool, because who is going to be telling the public to take a hammer to a cell phone or lithium battery? So there's a few issues to be dealt with that. We're also running into issues with fires and others from these battery collections, particularly lithium batteries that I'll talk about under the problem wastes. Also, if you haven't done these programs where you have boxes out in schools and other things for batteries, there is a potential there that many of us are concerned about, as well as handling those and potential fires happening. So something to be watchful for. The vape pen bill 1894 is for cannabis related ones where a label is required to be on the containers. And the advice is to let people know to take those vape pens to household hazardous waste programs. And it was a battle to get other authorized facilities in there. And we'll talk about that one as a problem waste stream. Also, the SB 212 for product stewardship on home generated sharps and pharmaceuticals is hitting the ground running, and a couple things I'll mention on that. So that's the effective legislation that's been approved. Some things under proposals, I won't get into too much details. That's ongoing discussions, but we have photoelectric bills on AB2 and 1238. Those are setting up programs for dealing with the solar panels. Hey, Mark. So the AB2 is for manufacturing end of life, more of a stewardship program. The 1238 is, the language is pretty vague on that, but it's trying to deal with the problem of allowing for better processing of solar panels in California, because currently to handle the solar panels, you're limited to physical breakage at these facilities that are receiving them. You can't use water, chemical, or heat without an extensive permitting process. So hopefully that will prevail in terms of allowing more local treatment options for California. Also, SB 560, many of you are probably familiar with the gas cylinders stewardship program. Currently it's limited to propane, helium, isobutane, and butane. But as of, hopefully it might be expanded to other ones, which I'll mention are problem wastes. And then we also have the SB 615 is electric vehicle batteries, trying to develop a program for dealing with the electrical vehicle batteries. And that's another one of the problem wastes I'll get into. A couple on the regulatory front to keep in mind is DTSC is doing their generator improvement rule. And the comments on that are going to be due on May 8th. And that's going to be taking what was done on the federal basis over 5 years ago and applying it to California with a few tweaks. And it's mostly going to affect the very small quantity generator rules on how they're able to handle waste. It gives them more leniency overall, but it will put them into more of a regulatory arena for dealing with their materials, so they'll be under a little more scrutiny. One of the things I and a few other people are watching out for reviewing those regs is that there's not unintended consequences for those of you taking very small quantity generators. You could end up being captured in some of the requirements in there, and we need to make sure that it's worded properly. It may or may not address the longstanding issue some folks have had is a household hazardous waste facility a large quantity generator or not? Some people say yes, some say no. Some of the regulators say yes, and some say no. It does make a difference on how you manage materials. So, and another one on the federal front and also in California, PFAS, PFOA, basically chemicals that have um, issues with them in terms of long-term health effects at very low concentrations, parts per trillion. There's efforts on the national basis to get that listed as a hazardous substance under CRRA, the Superfund. My big paranoia is that you hopefully won't have to start putting out boxes for Teflon containers, but we'll see where that one goes. And also the regulations on 212, 15 on covered batteries. So a lot going on out there. So that's it on the legislative front. I just thought I'd mention a little bit on the product, the SB 212 program. Many of you are familiar with this picture. I've shown it in many trainings where customers tend to throw everything into a box. And we get needles and lancets in that box that are poking through. So we now have a stewardship programs, and I encourage you to take a look at this on the website at Cal Recycle for handling sharps and pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals are either kiosks or mail away programs, but there's also so those will be out there in locations. They also designed to take the controlled substances. Many of you may still continue to take those in your household hazardous waste programs, but you won't get funding for that from the program. For the sharps, we will have programs for mail away containers, and some of you have taken a look at those programs. You can sign up with them through their portals to get reimbursement for the disposal cost and transportation for the home generated sharps containers. The Take Back Foundation one is allowing for people to request sharps containers, so I encourage you to reach out to them. They're that will provide you sharps containers to give people back as an exchange for the ones that they drop off. And I know somebody here mentioned that there is a lot of packaging with those. I think that's a conversation to have with them. Some of that might be required by the shipment method, but definitely in the interest of waste reduction, maybe looking at reducing that packaging. I know I'll be forwarding a message to them. That was brought up by one of the folks on the call. And just thought I'd illustrate where I live in Contra Costa County, the locations both between Med Project and NMAR, the Take Back Foundation, of where they have locations throughout the county. So there's a lot of them showing up. Already we've heard some issues with some of those containers being locked or not accessible or full. So that's always the problems with startups. But they do have programs you can sign up and get residents can get containers mailed to them, and I highly encourage that because that way you don't have to deal with the cost or the handling of that material. So it makes it a bit safer. Okay, on to AB 2481. This is one of the reasons we needed it. That container may look familiar to many of you as a normal everyday occurrence. And I'll come back to that guy later. So as I said, household hazardous waste regulations really haven't changed much since the 1990s. And so there's many questions, many issues, many inconsistencies between the existing statutes and regulations. So over 10 years ago, at one of the household conferences, a bunch of us got together and asked for the top 10 things we needed to change, both in regulations and legislation. I've kept track of that with questions from you folks, and that list was about 9 pages long. So there's a lot of things that need to be fixed in order to make these programs operate better. So, and I'll give shout out to my rural county folks, the RCRC, Rural County Representative of California. I gave that list to our lobbyist, John Kennedy, who is actually an employee of the rural counties, and he took and ran with it and got the bill. And I'm very happy to say it was part of the working group that I was on with them. We worked really well with DTSC and could good congratulations for them. They actually worked with us to try and fix any issues or questions from that. And also with some of the Koopas, and there was absolutely no opposition to that regulations. So yeah, thanks Courtney for showing that picture. That's definitely worth noting to the various vendors. I'm not sure which one of them it is, but I'm sure they both come in with a lot of that packaging material. So the program that's getting there still needs a little bit of work. So AB 2481 passed out of both houses of the legislature without any no votes, which is a pretty unusual occurrence. And the governor signed it. Took a little while. We were kind of wondering, but it did get signed, so now it's in law. So the major provisions is it allows transport between household hazardous waste facilities with no manifests, no hazardous waste transporter requirement. And I'll get into why that was important because it does help a lot of folks. So if you're, and also a Good Samaritan transport, allowing for that, and that was something that we needed to get fixed. A number of very small quantity generator provisions were added in. It allowed oil-based paint to be taken to recycle-only facilities and a few other things, and then allowed a person to exit a vehicle to provide access to the vehicle rather than trying to keep them in the vehicle. And also some abandoned waste provisions. And the most important thing was nothing in this legislation required a jurisdiction to adopt any of the standards. So you can pick what you want, you can pick some of it, you can implement parts. You don't have to do any of the activities here if you don't want to do that for your program. You still maintain that control. So that was very important in order to get support. So the transport. So pre-regulations, there was a number of household programs I'm familiar with that were taking HHW from one facility to another, particularly from a one-day event to a permanent facility was a common occurrence, or between permanent facilities, and that required payment of a manifest fee to DTSC. Under their restructuring, they got rid of their manifest fee, but they never got rid of the EPA manifest fee. So folks were paying anywhere from $8 to $25 per manifest. And I know a couple of programs that were spending over $10,000 a year on manifest fees to transport material from themselves, by themselves, to themselves between the different programs and provide copies of that to everyone. So that's what the system looked like previously, where anytime you went between any of these facilities, you'd have to use a hazardous waste manifest. And under 1383, you just use a simple bill of lading. So that should make life a lot easier. Probably the easiest scenario I can think of is when you have a temporary event and you collect a small amount of certain items, say methyl ketone peroxide, epoxy hardeners, and you only have a couple of containers in a 5-gallon bucket, as opposed to paying for entire cost. You can have that transported back to your permanent facility on a bill of lading without a hazardous waste hauler registration. So that's a big change, and also prohibited double counting of the waste stream because of the Form 303 reporting that was done. So might be interesting to see if there's any questions about that from anyone. Anybody planning on using that provision? Try to get some dialogue going here.
Larry, I heard from a bunch of folks that they were very excited about this. This is material in the amount of financial resources it'll save, and it certainly makes things a lot easier. Anybody else have any comments?
Yeah, this is Courtney. We have an HHW event every week, so we will definitely appreciate this because then we can transporting from the event to our facility will be much easier.
Larry, can you remind us again of the effective date on this?
January 1st, so it's already 4 months in.
Thanks.
So it's been in place. It also allows for load checking waste to come in the same way, provided you have an agreement with, they have an agreement with the facility. So you still have to keep a shipping paper for that, which is a bill of lading. Hazardous waste transporter registration is not required But just keep in mind that federal DOT may apply for placarding the vehicle as a hazardous materials transporter, not the waste side. So pretty much anything over 1,001 pounds would trigger that placarding driver hazmat endorsement. So the answer is you make multiple trips if you're not registered or have the placards for that. So once the facility consolidates that material, then you also have to use a manifest to send it to the ultimate destination. You also should be keeping track with that bill of lading of how much comes in, particularly for Form 303 reporting. And one question already came up from one of the Koopas is where does that shipping record, who gets to keep copies of that bill of lading? And pretty much it's both sites with your temporary records or your other permanent facility with those records, as well as the destination facility that you bring it to. So copies all around. So that's a very significant development for a lot of folks. So if no questions are on that one, I'll go on to the Good Samaritan one. This was intended because many of you get that person who died and left the material behind, and so the householder, their family was bringing it in, and if they're not the one that, quote, generated the material, then they're the only ones that were allowed to bring it in previously, and they can't bring it in because, of course, they're deceased. And so we developed the ability to bring that in with the Good Samaritan transport provision. And there were some concerns about that, particularly because it could be taken advantage of by some people. So the language in the legislation talks about on behalf of an individual unable or unavailable, including but not limited to death, illness, disability, and upon certification. So there is a certification requirement for that. That can be done many different ways. You could put it on a separate form. It could be part of your existing information, just something that shows that you did the due diligence. There's nothing in this provision that requires you to be asking everyone. So it's essentially, if it becomes known to you that they're bringing it in for someone else, a neighbor, a relative, then you have to have them do that certification. So that's at the time of delivery. They have to attest to the circumstances, such as the death, illness, disability, and also that they're not receiving compensation. That was a big provision, that they're not getting paid to do this. So I would argue even that gas money for that would be payment for delivering that material. And they also can't be employed by a hazardous waste transportation service, profit or not profit. And so that certification would get signed or filed with your existing facility documents. And the same transportation limits apply, the 5 gallon 50 pounds or 15 gallons 125 pounds for transit with the good information. So this could also be ripe for abuse for someone to bring something in for someone else and claim that they're not getting paid for it, or just because they didn't want to come in. That could be allowable under this. It's not something that was intended for that, but it could happen. But it was primarily designed for those cases where someone really wasn't able to bring it in, either elderly or disabled, or someone had died and left it behind. So I can provide also to Nate to send out a copy of a form that was developed for that. But basically, trying to make that they certify that they're transporting it on behalf of an individual and what the circumstances are, and that they're not receiving compensation. So back to this little picture. So shortly after January 1st, this guy comes in with a pickup truck. He said he was a contractor who worked for someone whose father had died. Both the gentleman whose father had died and the driver were outside of the service area. And so they technically wouldn't be eligible for use, but they were able to demonstrate that the waste did, or at least provided information that the person's waste stream did come from within the service area. But the person whose father had died, and also the person who delivered the material was from well outside the service area. And the guy admitted he was a contractor bringing that material in. But when asked, he said he wasn't not getting paid for this, which was kind of stretching reality to me. Also, some of those wastes could be household, they could be contractor waste. So we're going to continue to run into that issue and that dilemma. You'll have to use your own discretions on this, but we are trying to prevent the toxic taxi symptom, which actually was the name of a company that was collecting household hazardous waste from neighborhoods and bringing it in for free. They got stopped by the Certified Unified Program Agency, the CUPA. But this truck here actually does exist in Canada. That's their name, is Toxic Taxi. So there's the circumstances for it. So we'll continue to have that issue where people try to use these programs when they really shouldn't be or not qualified to use. But the dilemma many of you have is, if we don't take it, what are they going to do with it? Is it going to be dumped on the side of the road or somewhere else? And so can't fix every problem, but it does provide that legal aspect for the people that are unable or unwilling or unavailable to bring some material in. So has anybody had experience with that already, or that issue in general that they'd want to talk about? Very quiet group this morning. People think this is a good provision or opens up a can of worms, or both?
Hi, this is Rachel from County of Fresno. This has been great because in the running of day-to-day things, especially events, we get people who have larger volumes than would normally be considered residential. And sometimes we do have to make that call of whether this was a contractor or if it was a personal. But like you said, we don't want them illegally dumping it. We don't want them just driving down the road and saying, well, the heck with it. So we generally will take it. And now it's just making it legal for us to do that. And right. We don't have to worry about any blowback for it. And because, okay, for instance, Madera County is right above us. And many people who live in Madera are much closer to the Fresno facility than they are to Chowchilla. And so once in a while, we will get people who come through and they're from there. But again, we don't want to have them dispose of it improperly, so we will go ahead and take their waste. So, but not having to do the whole waste manifest and everything like that is awesome. And in most cases, I think people are just trying to do the right thing. So we just go ahead and take it. So I think it's been a good provision. I'm really glad that they made those changes.
Yeah, and thanks for that. And congratulations on the new facility. I want to get down there to see at some point. A couple things you mentioned to follow up on. One is the quantity limits people bring in. So for householders, there's a 15-gallon, 125-pound limit if you do advertising on safe transport and packaging. That limit is only on how much they can transport, not how much you can accept. You could still impose stringent rules on not accepting more than that or making them make multiple trips. But the whole idea was to discourage hauling too much waste at one point, but there's no prohibition on what you can accept as far as the amounts of material.
Right, and we have instructed people to go ahead and make multiple trips if they need to.
Yeah, just if they're there with 20 gallons, then you make a decision whether to take it or make them make a multiple trip or come back in half an hour. There's a lot of different ways people have handled that one. The other one is the jurisdiction of origin of the material. There's nothing in statutes or regulations that prohibits you from taking any jurisdiction's material. Most people tend to limit it to their own host jurisdiction because they're the ones paying for it. They shouldn't be subsidizing other jurisdictions. There are a number of jurisdictions that have reciprocal agreements where they were willing to share the cost for users from other facilities. And if you get a lot of people from a neighboring county, that might be something to look at with them, is working out some sort of an agreement for sharing that cost so you're not subsidizing them, because these programs are expensive.
Yeah, it's rare. It doesn't happen frequently. I think if it does, then we would do exactly as you just said.
Yeah. So this made it legal to accept someone who's died and left the material behind, but we did have to put in there because DTSC insisted on some sort of agreement or some sort of certification for that. So unfortunately, we had to add a little more paperwork into that, but how you go about choosing that is up to you to prove that. But you may get asked by Coupas whether you have any of those certifications from people, and it's kind of hard to say that you won't at some point. But yeah, that's the only. Plus, you'll get people taking advantage of this, and so you just have to deal with them as you always have. So VSQGs, very small quantity generators. So until DTSC gets the generator improvement rule passed, the term very small quantity generator does not exist anywhere in DTSC's determinations other than in the household hazardous waste arena. So that's where it was defined as 100 kilograms per month or 1 kilogram of extremely hazardous waste, which is something many of us tend not to put too much review into because there are a lot of extremely hazardous waste out there. Actually, the list was repealed many years ago. But anyway, that's the 100 kilograms, 220 pounds per calendar month for them. And you can charge a fee for that. So it wasn't clear whether you included universal waste in that determination or the paint under the stewardship program. So DTSC did get legislation passed a few years ago where when a generator calculates whether there's small or large, that they don't include universal waste in that determination, but the health and safety code for HHW is separate, and it still had a provision that required only 100 kilograms of hazardous waste, which would include universal waste. So we made that clear by taking out the universal waste and also paint under the paint stewardship programs, oil-based paint, latex, not included in determining the generatorship or whether you can that 100 kilogram limit. So when you're calculating up how much a generator, very small quantity generator is bringing in, you would take out and not include the universal waste or the paint for that. And again, you don't have to adopt that. You can still limit it to 100 kilograms of everything. But the example I used in discussing with DTSC, there were some Sony Trinitron TVs that weighed well over 220 pounds that would be illegal for them to bring in because it was over the limit. And so they agreed, and we did that provision. So also added into that, many of you, especially during the pandemic, experienced businesses closing. And so they were limited to bringing 100 kilograms per calendar month. And we were able to bring that into the 12 times 100 kilograms or a calendar year worth limit of 1,200 kilograms for that one business so they could make multiple trips within a calendar month to get rid of their material. So unlike households under very small quantity generators, you are limited to only accepting that 27 gallons, but not including the paint or universal waste. But it does allow for that. The term is episodic generation, but we couldn't use that term because that was part of the generator improvement rule and DTSC didn't want to go there. And saw Billy had a question and then his hand went down.
No, this is exactly what you say because in Santa Clara County issues, especially not just during the pandemic, even right now, we have several PSQG. They because it's an order, depends on the supply chain, right? So
right.
If the order came in and they have to they have to manufacture certain material, especially we have a facility that they typically make silicon wafer materials, and they use a lot of solvents, just all at once, and it's only
so
two times a year. And because of that, that is where they generate all these solvents. Otherwise, they wouldn't generate any hazardous waste at all. So this is where it really depends on the business itself, not necessarily that they're closing down, but also because of the supply chain and whenever they receive the order. And a typical month that they generate, it could be over 27 gallon. Last time they show
Right.
up is like over 100 gallon.
So this would allow it to be legal other than the 27-gallon limit per trip. So the other thing was allowing to take VSQGs in the same area and same time as the HHW. Although the regs haven't changed yet, the statute supersedes the regulation, so it is in effect. You still have to do the usual tracking the ID numbers, quantities, types, quantities, materials, track any fee. They are supposed to have prior arrangement, and so none of that changed. So it always brings into questions whether any of these are household or not. They all claim to be. As you can, many of them obviously are not, particularly the ones on the right side. And briefly, the oil-based paint allowance was allowed to be taken at recycle-only facilities. Many of you did it anyway, but technically you were operating a recycle-only and a paint program. Now you can do it in one location as part of the same program and not have to have two facilities adjacent. And then allowing the person to exit the vehicle. Many of you did encounter issues with people wouldn't stay in their vehicle because they don't trust you to open the vehicle with their glove. And so it allows them to get out, to open it, to provide access to the material, but they have to immediately return. So how you force them to get back in is a question. I always stress not trying to allow them to handle the material on site. And then many of you also take abandoned waste into your HHW program. There's provisions here to allow for that even more without a transporter registration. For public agencies or your contractor, you still have a limit. You have a limit of 55 gallons or 500 pounds being transported at a time. And as long as the agency bringing it in didn't dispose of it themselves. So that one still needs a bit more cleaning up, but at least we got that into there. So it is effective. Some regulations need to be changed to catch up to it, but the legislation overrides that regulation. So, and again, you're not required to adopt it. So just wanted to put a shout out to the John Kennedy for that. You can always send thanks to him at jkennedy@rcrcnet.org. As appreciation for that, because without him, it would have been a list. So he was the one that carried it through. So problem wastes. So these are only a few of the ones that have been popping up lately. I was at one of the sites doing a training, and this is all too typical where they marked something to save for me, try to identify what refrigerant was in there. I just thought that was kind of cute. So some of you may have seen this from the trainings. If you don't know what those are, you can put a guess into the chat. But this came into a HHW program from someone. These are dialysis pumps. So they adhere to the body. They have medicine, a needle, a battery, and a little bit of circuitry. There is no one classification for that. And so this apparently was brought in from one person. I guess they've been accumulating for a while. So it was their story. It could have been from a clinic or something, but it could also have been from a house. So has anybody encountered these that they want to get rid of and know how to get rid of them? Where would you put them?
Burn 'em.
What was that? Burn them?
Sorry.
Yeah, they don't fit into any one category. So the person who got this actually did a little experimentation where they were able to pop it open and pull out the battery and then put the rest in for toxic materials. But they do have a lithium battery. So there is no program for returning these to the hospitals or clinics. So maybe that's another one, whether they'll fit into the SB 212 program. We'll see. So Again, another material out there with not a very easy answer for. The vape pens. Well,
Just a
Billy?
question. Does that one has still have the medicine in there?
They probably are empty of medicine at the time, but you never know. There might be some medicine in some of those. So they could be empty of medicine, but they still have a needle and a battery and a little bit of circuitry. And the e-waste people don't want them because of the needle. The Sharps people don't want it because of the battery.
Yes.
So quite honestly, if you got a couple of them, toxic solid might be the most appropriate place for them if they're empty. Vape pens. Many of you have encountered these. They might not be nicotine, they might be cannabis. Some of them you can take the battery out, some of them you can't. So if you can remove the battery, then the battery can be handled as a battery. If it's empty of liquid, it can be handled as electronic waste. But if there's liquid still in it, either nicotine or cannabis, and there's no way to tell the difference, the hazardous waste companies don't want them. There is a company that is taking some of these vape pens. And drawing a blank on the name of that company, so maybe somebody can put that into the chat, those who've dealt with them.
Gallega.
Gallega, there you go. Thanks, Billy.
How do you spell that? There you go. Gallega. Okay, got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So they're the only option I know of for taking the vape pens with contents. Hazardous waste companies basically say put them aside, or put them in a separate container, and then they'll try to figure out what to deal with it. But this is an ongoing problem, and it's going to get worse because the legislation now requires the packaging to have a label says take it to your HHW program or other authorized facility. Yes, Courtney.
Yeah, so I was talking to Geico late last year, and they ship everything to, I think, Georgia, and everything just gets shredded. And they showed me a video of it, and there was no way to contain the nicotine or the cannabis. It just like as a unit gets shredded. And so for that reason, I have not sent anything to them, and I won't until they change that process.
Which is probably legal in that state to deal with, especially from households.
Yeah, it might be.
But yeah, it's always worth finding out where these things are ultimately ending up. But if not them, then where? So it's another problem waste stream, and it's only going to get worse with the advertising that was promoted by the legislation. And there's the ones that come apart, and some of them don't. High capacity batteries. They're out there from scooters, e-bikes. They're also part of leaf blowing equipment, greater than 300 watt hours, and they're very big. That silver one did not fit in a small drum either, so it had to go into a bigger drum. So trying to figure out watt hours, it's helpful to know the formula because sometimes it's not always written on it like this one. And I'll show you how useful that is in a moment. But these do require special handling by DOT. They are expensive to get rid of. And anything over 300 watt hours is not going to be covered by the battery legislation, other than from e-bikes, and motor scooters will be covered under the battery program. So damaged batteries, many of you have seen those. They get also known as puffies. So the middle ones are called a recycle box that caught fire in transit. I also know of a household program that shipped batteries that most likely were protected and they still caught fire. And this one on the right, in the corner, you can see it. This is at one of the facilities that was processing batteries, and one of them caught fire when they were opening up the container. So it can happen at almost any point. And this is one of the big fears with the battery collection programs out there that are going to be part of the new legislation coming up. So make sure you know how to deal with your DDRs, damaged, defected, recalls, or puffies, because they are going to continue to be a problem. And that's DOT's proof of why they think where there is a problem out there with these. And garbage truck fires, MRF fires. Everybody probably has heard about the San Mateo facility that caught fire with $8.3 million of damage. There was one in Southern California that had over $20 million worth of damage. So lithium batteries are continuing to be a problem. And for those who hadn't seen it, here's one of the training demonstrations of what happens when you run over a battery. Just the pressure of squeezing those particularly larger lithium batteries causes it to catch fire. So electric vehicle batteries, subject to legislation. They're not all lithium, as I've been finding out. Some of them are nickel metal hydride. And it took a while for this one on the right to be determined that it was nickel metal hydride. But they're coming in all shapes and sizes. They're not really identifiable. So I thought I'd give you a few hints. I mean, you can look for, barely you can see a nickel metal hydride term in here. But a lot of these ones on the left just don't have very distinguishing characteristics. But they're all different shapes and sizes, as you can tell. So if you look at the batteries, you can look for identifying numbers on them for clues. And what you do with those numbers, put them into a search engine, and you can end up with information telling you that what they are. And with a little bit of math, you can figure out that in this case, these were over 300 watt hours. And you can notice how many in there, 44 of those batteries, little like D-cell batteries in one unit. And you get more than one unit. So it's not the whole battery coming in, they're coming in individual cells. Another one came in, these. So how do you figure out what those are? So you can barely see any identifying lettering on here, but there's no numbers left
Learn
of
how
it.
to read Chinese. That is exactly what Chinese is lithium batteries.
Well, I didn't have that ability, and I wasn't going to give you a call, Billy, but I did a little image search, and it actually showed me one. So they looked the same, and did the calculation, again, over 300 watt hours. So, yeah, and John noted Calder Recycle is accepting e-bike battery bikes for most brands.
The other good thing I noticed is because when you use an image search, if you guys have your cell phone, download a Google Lens, take a picture of it. Sometimes it helps you identify faster than just image search. And the success rate I had is over 80%. So not bad to try the Google Lens. Just another tools that I want to share with everyone.
Yeah, you will get a lot of things that look similar but aren't batteries, but pretty certain this was a battery. And it did look identical to that. Yeah, so Google Lens is a good option. I have that as well. So this also was noted as either an electric vehicle battery or for a solar system. So those are also coming in. And the EV battery legislation is not looking at the solar system batteries for battery backup. And if you don't recognize that, that's a solar panel that was rolled up and put in the garbage. And those are subject to some of the other legislation. So here's the little quiz I came up with just to figure out what they are. And so in discussion with DTSC, we came up with a simple test. What is the primary function of the device? If it's simply to provide power, then it's going to be considered a solar panel. If it does other things like sound or music or numbers, then it's going to be an electronic device. So for some reason, DTSC wanted to keep solar panels separate from electronic devices. I suspect mostly for statistics purposes, but you can't put them in the same box, so you have to know how to tell the difference. And so here's what we came up with. It's very good to note that finally, after years and years of discussion, because after we came up with this criteria, what's the primary function, DTSC's website still had garden lights on the list as a solar panel, when in fact it's providing light. And now when you look at their website, it does show it as an electronic device. So they finally changed that. So that's one of the problem waste streams we're dealing with, small and large. Very few household hazardous waste facilities. I think Davis is the only one accepting it. I know, Courtney, you guys are getting ready for a one-day event for that to see with the solar panels. VPSC did a series of events. There's a whole dialogue going on how to deal with solar panels because, like e-waste, not all of them are hazardous, but you can't tell the difference. So fire extinguishers, those are coming in. They have always been coming in. We don't various shapes and sizes. Some of the older ones, like this little glass bulb, are carbon tetrachloride, which is a pretty nasty chemical. It's been banned from use, but it's still out there. Halon fire extinguishers, these old brass ones, are a great collector's item. I know I have one that's empty, but it has sulfuric acid in there for soda ash. So those are handled as hazardous waste. The dry chemical ABC type, many people end up handling those as hazardous. They're pretty expensive to get rid of. Most of them contain ammonium phosphate or monoammonium phosphate chemicals, both of which tend to be very low toxicity, if at all. Safety data sheets I've looked at don't indicate they're over the hazardous waste toxicity limit, although no one's done a fish toxicity on it. So some facilities will actually discharge these into a container and save the powder and send that off as a hazardous waste, toxic solid, and then try to dispose of the metal either as scrap metal or as garbage. But it definitely saves the cost of getting rid of these. Occasionally, rarely, I've had an ability to get rid of these by giving them to the fire extinguishing companies that service extinguishers. So you might try that option first because they can reuse the powder. The gas inside is usually carbon dioxide, sometimes nitrogen. So it's overall, there's nothing clearly indicating these are hazardous waste other than being pressurized. But for lack of options, then they end up being handled as hazardous waste. So maybe take a look at those and maybe look at another system. They are pressurized, but if you depressurize them and put the powder into a container, there are some household facilities that do that. They'll shoot it into a funnel or into a drum. So especially with costs going up, it's something to look at for those. And then gas cylinders. This is
one thing
This
I
is-
want to chime in on this just to
Yeah.
save some monies. When you actually get your HHW facility for your fire extinguisher service, sometimes you can talk to your folks if they would want to take it for their training purposes, and they can take it for free. That's just my
the fire
experience.
departments. Yeah, that's another good option you can try for. So hopefully these will get captured into the legislation for press gas cylinders. At the moment, they're not. One of the ones I found a lot of is these cylinders here for nitrous oxide that are used for whipping cream. One of the facilities got a bunch of these coming in over time on the solid waste facility. Some of them have gone through the trucks, and they've got over 100 of these that we're saving. And I went through and tested them, and only out of over 100 of these, only 4 of them had any pressure in them whatsoever. So technically, they would qualify as an empty container, as solid waste, not hazardous waste. But without a gauge or some other way to tell, then you would end up handling them and get rid of them. And so the other problem with these is nitrous oxide is flammable. So putting them even empty into a baler is a concern. We're looking at trying to see what that would happen. If not, maybe putting them in as solid waste if they can't go into scrap metal. Courtney, yeah, Davis at Yolo County Landfill is accepting solar panels and has been even before they became universal waste. That's the only one I know of for sure that's taking them.
And Larry, they're then shipping them out of state, or?
Yeah, I believe some of them were being sent in state for processing what they could, and the rest were going out of state. I think they were ultimately, many of them were ending up out of state. because we don't have ability to process them very well in California. Hence the need for the legislation earlier.
Thank you, Larry. Just want to point out we've got about 2 minutes left.
Yep. Hey, Dave. Yeah, little whippets, little tiny ones, but we've been getting the big ones. So the other use for these, other than whipping cream, is they're also really great, at least according to the websites, for huffing, for people to supposedly get a high off of. Not a very safe and a very dangerous practice. But so we got nitrous oxide, we've got the insulation, we've got the propane ones that we've been trying to get legislation for. Oxygen, here's a pesticide compressed gas cylinder. So Julia became a hazardous waste transporter by picking them up on the street. Cool. Usually they're empty.
They were
so
empty.
they're not a hazardous waste then. They can go in the garbage or recycling. So compressed gas cylinders are out there. This is hopefully going to be into the legislation. Marine flares, many of you had experience with these. There's been a couple of events. This is another problem waste stream. So they're very expensive to get rid of because they are classified as explosives. They need special handling, special permits, a very expensive program. And again, there's no stewardship program for handling these. So hopefully that's something we can get going, or something to make it a little bit easier to manage those. So with a little bit of time left, some questions or any other problems to fix, and I can hang around for a few minutes extra if needed. But yeah, that's just a few of the waste streams. I didn't have a chance to put in a lot here because of the timing, but I think another topic might be being looked at, and we did this at the Household Conference, Used Oil Symposium, is looking at the whole cost issue that's going on and ways to be more efficient on handling your household hazardous waste program. There are some things we came up with, some suggestions for that, because many of you need to be looking at that in terms of your budgets. But I think that's a whole nother session that we could have on dealing with this costs and management of the waste streams. So
Great. And so before
appreciate
the
that.
webinar
Sorry, there wasn't
ends-
more questions. But
Yeah, does anybody have any questions before I do my closing remarks? That's it. Anybody? Anybody? So before the webinar ends, I just wanted to say a special thanks to Larry. He covered a lot of ground on this webinar, and we're very fortunate to have him involved directly or indirectly on the bills, the sign laws, and really the regulations that he mentioned today. So thank you, Larry. We really appreciate
You're
you
welcome.
and your time. Today's webinar was sponsored by the California Resource Recovery Association and their HHW Technical Council. Just a reminder of who we are in the HHWTC. We're composed of household hazardous waste professionals who are responsible for and committed to the safe and cost-effective management of HHW. The HHWTC provides a forum for discussion and information sharing about universal and hazardous waste management. Participation in the HHWTC is open to both CRRA members and non-members. So this is a new thing. If you haven't been involved, if you're not a member of CRRA, don't let that hold you back. I also wanted to mention that today's webinar was hosted by the California Product Stewardship Council. That's us. Very happy to have you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll have this webinar posted to the CPSC YouTube channel sometime in the next day or so, so be sure to check it out there. And as always, if you have any questions, don't be shy. Let us know. I just put my email address and Larry's email address into the chat. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Gotta get those pictures out of there.
Yeah.
So I forgot to tell people I'm going on vacation, so I may not be able to reach it back out to people right away.
I'll let folks know if they reach out.
It'll be on my email.
Okay. Excellent.
But yeah, thanks for that.
Larry, this went really well. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Yeah.
This is
A
awesome.
few questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that might be, like I suggested, another session is looking at this cost issue. I think we had a really good session at the conference and maybe repeating that here.
Yeah.
I don't know if everybody got a chance to see that.
Yeah, I definitely do believe it's worth looking at in greater detail, and that's something that the HHWTC can certainly facilitate. We've got the budget yet to do another webinar, so hopefully we can have you back and do another one.
Well, there's a few other people have been involved in this as well.
Yeah,
that issue.
Of course.
So, okay.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and thanks again.
Sure. Talk
Take
to you
care.
later.
Bye-bye.